Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dutiful Future. Yes, it's been a while. I know it was a long time since we had the last podcast, and it's been a long time since we're having this one, but it doesn't matter. And we're back with a fantastic guest. We couldn't have a better guest to mark the return of the Dutiful Future podcast than one of the most exciting political correspondents and political coverages around. We have the co-host of the New Statesman podcast and political correspondent for the New Statesman, Ailbhe Rea. Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very glad to have you here. Been a fan of your work for a long time. I would recommend everyone, of course, check out the New Statesman podcast. Check out Ailbhe's work on New Statesman. Of course, follow Ailbhe on Twitter @pronounced Ailbhe. Ailbhe spelled Ailva, but not in reality. It's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got that in early. Very good. The Twitter handle.
Oh, don't worry. I'm going to have it edited right under your face as well. It's going to be everywhere. Every 5 seconds is an advert. It's beautiful.
Right.
YouTube's a great place. Anyway, so let's just start off introducing yourself here. So when I spoke to Lewis Goodall ages ago, one of the first journalists I ever spoke to, he said that every journalist has to find their niche. They have to find their thing that defines them and what makes them stand out. Would you say that you have something that is your specific focus, or would you say that you tend to pick anything a bit more broad? How would you define your work as a journalist?
Ooh, good question to start. Nice to follow in Lewis Goodall's illustrious footsteps because he's brilliant. I suppose my honest answer is that I still feel like a relatively new journalist, which is maybe one of the reasons why I'm interesting to speak to, because I think maybe once journalists become more established, they forget how it is starting out. Whereas I'm still, I've been a journalist for 3 years, so not really very long at all. And so I suppose I'm still kind of looking for my niche in a way. Some of it is kind of defined just by the existing job and at the New Statesman. And I think if I moved, then that would change organically. But I suppose the New Statesman, however much coverage we do of the Conservatives and of the government, we're just always seen as the authorities on Labour and the Labour Party. And that's sort of the area where we are expected to have a particular level of expertise. And so that's a kind of natural niche, I suppose, just as a function of working for the New Statesman. And I think I had a sense when I started at the NS of needing to get that right first, especially because not that long after I started in the job, there was a leadership contest. And Stephen Bush, the political editor, said, the one thing we cannot get wrong is the rules around a Labour leadership contest. And we need to have this down to pat. We need to know exactly which way every single Labour MP is planning to vote in this. We need to kind of set the standard. Sure. So I think that was like a thing to get right first. But then I suppose the other niche sort of, I never really did this consciously, but obviously I'm from Belfast. And I suppose I never really set out to do much coverage of Northern Irish politics or the politics of the island of Ireland, especially because when I joined the New Statesman, Patrick Maguire, who's now at the Times, was a colleague at the New Statesman, and he's one of the best journalists on Northern Ireland in these islands. He's really, really great on it. So I didn't feel like I needed to be covering it, and I also thought I didn't really want to be typecast as the sort of the Belfast girl in London who's obsessed with Belfast. But I kind of have become that anyway, especially because Patrick's no longer at the NS. And I think that Northern Ireland is covered really, really badly in Westminster. So as just sort of sort of the way circumstances have worked out, I've ended up doing quite a bit of Northern Irish coverage, which I do really, really enjoy doing. And I went to the Republic of Ireland to cover the last general election right before the pandemic. So I suppose my niches are the Labour Party in Northern Ireland, but I would imagine that will change, and I'm in a way I'm maybe hoping that it does. I think it would be weird if so early in my career I knew what my niche was or exactly what I want to do. I think I'm still sort of working it out.
No, yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, 3 years in journalism is not a long time, especially considering the fast pace of the environment, and to already be on the New Statesman podcast and writing on super important issues like Northern Irish politics is incredibly impressive. And I think I definitely agree your prescription as a sort of a lack of coverage on the Northern Ireland issue, because I consider myself a politics nerd, if you could guess, and it's something that I struggle to find any information about, and I really struggle to sort of be able to learn about. And I think a lot of your writing has sort of come into that. And I'm sort of interested in asking the relationships of Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, and of course with Brexit as well. How difficult of an issue is it to cover? Because it seems to be a really fast-paced and chaotic one, be it due to, say, the current government's common, I'd say flip-floppery or like random changing of directions. I mean, your most recent article was about them trying to rewrite the deal straight away. I'm sort of interested in how difficult of an issue is this to cover due to its complexity or fast-paced nature?
Yeah, I think I would say that in a way it's almost too difficult to cover, because ultimately it's a trade issue now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably journalists have had a choice as to whether they run with the Brexit story and cover it in all of its detail and cover it really well and get into it. Someone like Adam Payne, who I know you've had on before, has really sort of grasped the Brexit issue and sort of become a real authority on it. And then I think other people, especially, the politics team at the New Statesman, if we're covering everything, then I feel like we're just sort of on nodding terms with the Brexit issue. And so whenever there's a big announcement, you sort of ring around your sources and find out the multiple perspectives. You get someone from the British government, someone from the Irish government, or another EU perspective. And then you speak to some of the Northern Irish parties about issues with the protocol and read up around it and sort of briefly develop some expertise. And then it goes out the window again because you don't hear about it for a few months. So I think it is a really hard issue to cover. I had a drink last night with a source who works, for the government on Brexit, and I'm just really aware that, thank goodness there are other journalists who have really decided to just focus on this in particular, because I think there's a real sense of a lot of journalists are not experts in trade policy, and some of this is like really, really technical, and so you have to kind of be led by your sources. There are particular politicians, some people in different Northern Irish parties who have cultivated quite a lot of expertise on the protocol and the issues with it in order to scrutinise it properly. But you kind of have to use their expertise, which is probably not a great way of doing things. So yeah, I would say I think Brexit is a really, really tough issue. And I think that with some notable exceptions, it's no longer being covered very well. I think people are quite bored of it, and the politics of it, and the politics of the protocol, and the objections to it in the unionist community are still very, very, very interesting and important. And that bit's quite easy to cover. But the actual trade technicalities, I think, are really dry for a lot of people, and so there's no real incentive, even when there were quite big developments with Brexit over the past year and a half. The pandemic slightly dwarfed them, is my experience. I don't know if you would agree that there's not.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I also think because the fact that it went on for so long, the issue of Brexit, I think people just kind of got tired, and I think that's really been mirrored in political messaging, where it's like I think it was the Labour Party who just sort of said, we've got to live with it now. We've got to fight for our best future within that. On this issue of sort of people struggling to maintain interest in that, your colleague at the New Statesman, Freddie Hayward, recently wrote an article on how the majority of British voters feel little connection to Northern Ireland and Northern Irish people. How do you think that, why do you think this is, and how do you think this is going to impact Northern Ireland's membership of the rest of the UK and relationship with Brexit going forwards?
Yeah, well, so I think that's actually an interesting question, because it also, I think, raises a question about polling in general. In that I don't have the article in front of me, but if I recall it, I was on holiday when Freddie wrote it up, and I think it is, it did have kind of quite significant cut through. People I've been speaking to over the past few weeks have mentioned this polling that, as you say, showed that a plurality have little connection to Northern Ireland. But I think that there's a challenge with polling in general. It's the same if you poll sort of whether people think of themselves as patriotic, for example, that if people describe themselves as not very patriotic, for example, or, they have little connection, or, a small connection to Northern Ireland, something like that, it's difficult to know whether that's whether you count that as, yes, you're patriotic, yes, you have a connection to Northern Ireland, or whether you don't. And so I think that kind of how you interpret that, and it's entirely open to interpretation. I think pollsters talk about this and struggle with it as well. It depends on how you read the people saying that they have some connection or little connection to Northern Ireland, because that's not no connection, I suppose. And the no connection was still smaller. But definitely in general, I think this has just been has been a sad reality of Ulster unionism for a while, that despite the strength of feeling among unionists in Northern Ireland and that really profound connection to the British state, it's not always reciprocated. There are plenty of people on the benches of the House of Commons who are committed unionists with a really deep understanding of Northern Ireland, but and similarly plenty of people, I think, in the UK, the rest of the UK, who take an interest in Northern Ireland and care deeply about it. But I think in general there is a real lack of understanding, and I think it's a common experience of unionists when they come to the mainland to be treated as Irish and to feel slightly affronted that they're not recognised as British. And but then there's a question as to also how the people in the Republic of Ireland relate to Northern Ireland. And I think maybe the sad reality is that Northern Ireland is seen by quite a lot of people, whether they're in the Republic or whether they're in mainland Britain, as a bit of a problem and as a bit of a burden. And so it maybe cuts both ways. It's not just that people in the rest of the UK don't feel so much of a connection to Northern Ireland, as also maybe people in the Republic, even if they feel more of an instinctive connection, don't necessarily want the burden of the economic ties and so on.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I was interested to ask, so is this sort of the feeling of sort of like fish out of water, or that, being in almost like a different country? Is this something that you think you've ever felt in terms of your own journalism and the own work that you've done, sort of breaking into the journalism sphere so quickly that sometimes you're sort of almost typecast as, the Irish journalist? Is this something that you think you've personally experienced, or is this maybe sort of a more niche personal experience?
Well, so I suppose I meant in particular unionists who feel very British, feeling suddenly Irish. I'm sort of less worried about being treated as Irish here.
Sure, it's more of a specific group thing.
But I think it's actually been fine. I mean, Stephen at the New Statesman, Stephen Bush, used to always be very wary of asking me to cover Northern Irish stories because he didn't want to typecast me. And then I've just become more and more comfortable doing it. And actually, I really enjoy doing it because it feels more important than other journalism in a way, because it's so badly covered. It feels like there's a real need for it. And people are very interested. As you say, I find that even other journalists say that they seek out good, informative content on Northern Ireland, and they don't feel that there is very much. So I actually don't mind it. But it was funny to me when there was the most recent spate of violence in Northern Ireland a few months ago. I think I did one piece on it, on the sort of the different factors contributing to the sudden riots and trouble, and I think I had maybe 50 media requests. I felt like I felt like a politician doing a media round at one point. I think it was like 5 or 6 appearances a day. So, you only had to sort of go there for a second, and suddenly people think, because I think actually a lot of media outlets based in London don't even really know which commentators to get to speak about Northern Ireland. So suddenly one person emerges, and you only do one piece, and suddenly you're in such high demand. I did try to pass on the details of other Northern Irish journalists who are actually in Northern Ireland for a lot of that, because I think that's important too. But I don't mind it actually, and I mean, I'm sure that's a general feeling that you feel more. If you go on holiday, I'm sure you feel more English abroad than you do at home, for example, or more British abroad than you do at home. I think that's a kind of universal experience. So I'm happy to own that in a way.
It's an interesting balance really between sort of, we talk about like the issue of typecasting, but then you can look at the other side of the coin. You think, British journalism has always had a long-standing history and long-standing problem with a lack of regional accents and regional people who aren't from Surrey or London. And I think that having people who are from different parts of the country and will have slightly more diverse opinions is important, particularly on issues which aren't directly, Westminster related. Is this is this something that you think you've noticed, that maybe a particular lack of like regional accents or own voices on certain issues, and that sort of balance between not like typecasting, but then also wanting people who are or who were directly related to an issue to be able to talk about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it has been one of the strengths of the New Statesman. I think an MP said to me at one stage that a thing that they liked about the New Statesman podcast, when it was the four of us with Patrick Maguire as well, was that we were all very identifiably from somewhere. Mm-hmm. So Stephen is a proud Londoner, and Patrick's from Southport. Anush also a Londoner, and then I'm from Northern Ireland. And I think maybe that quite distinctive sense of place adds another dimension to journalism. It's not really. I mean, I think the fact that, for example, Stephen and Anush are very rooted in an experience of London mm-hmm. is just as helpful as me being from Northern Ireland or whatever. But I think there's maybe this slightly anonymous home counties approach that some people take to their journalism, where you don't really have any sense of where people are from or mm-hmm. where they're coming from. But certainly, I don't. It's an interesting question. I've never really thought about it in terms of regional accents or so on. I think probably the actual like a class element is more important than the regional mm-hmm. element. I mean, I think that's the sort of joke that people make, that someone from the north, from a very middle class family, goes to university in the south of England and people think that they're working class, and because of the accent, mm-hmm. but it's like a completely different metric. Yeah. And so I think probably they're still, the thing that really strikes me about journalism is just quite how many people were privately educated, rather than the regional diversity, actually, because mm-hmm. often under the surface you realize that people, I'm thinking of people at The Spectator, for example. Katie Bowles has an English accent, but she grew up in Scotland and mm-hmm. has like a very deep understanding of Scotland and Scottish politics, on top of her expertise in other things. So I think that it's not so much a regional thing as a class thing, but I would just I'm just very aware of the, and I'm sure you're aware too, of the challenges for people who don't have a lot of connections, or who weren't privately educated, trying to find a route into journalism. And I think I was surprised when I started as a journalist quite how bad that still is, because mm-hmm. there's so many comment pieces written about the need to diversify journalism and to sort of end nepotism in that industry, and I'm still surprised that it still happens. So I think that's the most important thing. I've also definitely never found that having a Belfast accent is an issue. I don't have a particularly strong one. I think people can still understand me, but I think people kind of like if you're a bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't worry, I'm not going to be putting subtitles under this video. I'm going to trust the people to understand a very faint an accent. It's an interesting one for me to talk about sort of nationality in different countries, because some background on me, I grew up internationally for most of my life. I lived in Asia for a long time, lived in America for a long time, and like I said before we started recording, most of my family are Scottish. So it's weird to sort of talk about British places. I don't know where anywhere in Britain is. I've lived here for about probably 7 years now, but I still don't know where anything is. I don't understand anything. I learned the other day what a cream tea is.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm.
That was exciting.
Very good.
So it's an odd one for me to try and navigate, I think. And I think on the issue of journalism, it is an important one, because I think, especially for a long time, it's sort of an industry which can be dominated by a specific type of person and a specific type of network, and it sort of self-reinforces as it goes along.
I think actually a thing I would add on that I think is just really important, and that I don't think that publications or media outlets think about enough, is just the the advantage of being from or from near London. And I think in that sense, being, from a region is a significant disadvantage, because there are, really to get a leg up in journalism, you need to be in London. There are obviously exceptions, but that was definitely my experience. And if you are, if you've just graduated and you're in London, or you've just left school and you're in London or near London, or you have family that you can stay with in London, then you can kind of afford to take on badly paid work or not paid work to get that initial experience and to get an understanding of a newsroom and to build some initial contacts. And if you don't have any way of being in London without a significant cost, you're immediately on the back foot. And I think that's why properly paid opportunities at entry level are really, really important. And some places are kind of trying to address that, but I don't think that it's really discussed enough.
No, that's really interesting. I think as a recent graduate, the issue of sort of paid and unpaid work is very different, because I live just outside of London, so taking like an internship would be very doable for me, which wouldn't be. But for someone else who, say, doesn't live as far or has different living situations, it's a very different situation. And I think can be very difficult to sort of try and break in. And I think, journalism is an industry that's famously difficult to try and get in. So what actually was your story? How did you make it in onto, one of my personal favorite podcasts?
I'm always very happy to share this story, because I think it's important to be as honest as possible about this sort of thing, or else it's just completely opaque to people on the outside looking in. So when I graduated, I was home in Belfast for a few months and applying for just lots of different jobs. I had this sort of mistaken idea that a job in publishing would be quite easy to get. So and then it actually just completely wasn't. I don't know why I thought it, but I just thought,
I know the feeling.
I was like, I'll just apply for a sort of nice graduate job. And then that was kind of difficult. And after maybe a month of that, I thought, well, it turns out it's hard to get any sort of job. So I should just try to get the jobs I actually want. And I'd wanted to be a journalist for quite a long time, but did I? I mean, I remember I have a very early memory of telling my parents that I wanted to be Andrew Marr, and I really embarrassing.
I mean that hair. I mean, how can
I used to watch it every Sunday. So I always thought that a career like that would be really, really rewarding, but I just didn't understand how you would get there. And even looking at the career of someone like Andrew Marr, I couldn't understand how he went from his English degree at Cambridge to a job at a newspaper, I think in Glasgow, and then eventually becoming one of the founders of The Independent to BBC political editor. I just could not see how you went from one thing to the other. But I think that, again, being really, really honest, I think I had a sense from my mid-teens that I should go to Oxford or Cambridge, and that was like an obvious way that people lay an initial foundation that helps them into whatever job they want next. So I kind of thought that if I got into Oxford, then that would help me do whatever I wanted to do in journalism or elsewhere. So I graduated still kind of wanting to be a journalist, but not just having no real idea how to do it, and also with a sense that I didn't have enough experience. Because when I arrived at Oxford, I just had this feeling that everyone would be better than me, and so I didn't even bother to get involved in student publications for the first few years, because I just thought, why should I be writing an article when there are thousands of people here who would probably do a better one? And also, I think it's also maybe a London thing. I definitely arrived, and there were plenty of people, especially people who'd grown up in London, who I think were just a bit more mature and arrived at Oxford. They'd already done work experience at the Guardian, and they knew exactly what they wanted to do. and were immediately writing things for Cherwell or the Oxford Student, and immediately involved. And I found that all that quite overwhelming when you're just an 18-year-old and you don't really know anything. So I didn't get involved in the first few years, and I think practically from first year I felt like I'd missed the boat on becoming a journalist because I wasn't doing any of that stuff. And so it was only in my final year that I got involved with the ISIS magazine. And I'm giving you loads of detail, but don't just think I think it's helpful to know exactly.
No, please keep going.
So the way the ISIS magazine works, it's one of the oldest student magazines in the world, I think, and lots of really amazing people have written for it at some stage, just by dint of it being the Oxford Student magazine for a very long time. So it's normally 1 or 2 editors and 3 or 4 deputy editors, or no, 2 deputy editors, and then about 5 or 6 sub-editors, plus a wider team and contributors. And I applied to be one of the sub-editors. And I think that, that's not a particularly prestigious role, but because the magazine is so prestigious, I suppose, even though it has a bit of a reputation for just being lots of photos of people's gap years now, I think it's probably declined since the days of Sylvia Plath and Evelyn Waugh were writing for it. But I think maybe, like 400 or 500 people tried to apply to be sub-editor, because that's one of the few things. So I really didn't think I was going to get it. And then I had an interview with the then editor on it was the evening before the Christmas break at like 7 p.m. It was really, really dark and cold, and she was really late, and I just thought clearly there is no point in this. And then she arrived and she said, obviously your application really stood out, and and which was really nice, because I had lots of opinions on what the ISIS magazine should be doing differently. So I became sub-editor and then deputy editor, and I was offered the editor role, but a few terms later, but I didn't take it because I was doing my finals. But I really got that little bit of journalistic experience really in the nick of time. And I think if I hadn't done that, it would be really, really, really hard to then, it would have been even harder to get any sort of subsequent experience. So basically, when I had graduated, I had this sense of wanting to be a journalist, but still not really having enough experience. And I felt that I probably didn't have enough experience to even get onto the Masters in Journalism at City University. And so I basically just decided that I should try for a year to get as much experience in journalism as I could, and at the end of the year to reevaluate. And to basically, I think my thinking was, having seen how people do things in Oxford, to sort of assert myself like a rich person. So to just try to get the experience and approach the beginning of my journalistic career as though I was someone who had a lot of money, with my parents backing me, but to just use the savings I had from when I was teaching in France on my year abroad, because I lived in the school and didn't have to pay rent. So I just decided I'm going to move to London and try to get experience in journalism for a year, ideally paid, but if I have to sort of support myself or do other jobs, I'll just do that. And at the end of the year, I'll see what the lay of the land is and maybe try to do the journalism masters at the end of that. And so I moved to London and applied to loads of places asking for training contracts and internships and opportunities. And I emailed George Osborne, who was then editor of the Evening Standard, who had also edited the ISIS magazine when he was at Oxford. And he campaigned to legalise marijuana. It was his famous issue of the ISIS magazine. Pretty good. Yeah, mysteriously, all of the copies of that magazine have vanished from Oxford libraries. I'm not even joking. You can't get a copy of it.
There's a 1984 style stamp over all of them. Everything's just redacted.
Yeah, honestly, you can't find a copy.
Really, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a stuff of legend, but everyone knows that that's the way it is. I think you can find it online. So I emailed him asking, sort of just a cheeky, friendly email, asking for a job, And he replied within half an hour and said, yeah, come in for an interview. And which was really exciting. I was still at home in Belfast. I was moving to London like the following week. That was really exciting. So I just went in, had this conversation with him about Northern Irish politics and Brexit and Theresa May and what I thought of the Evening Standard and so on. And then he said, well, you can start on the Diary, which is where he started out at the Times. He did some shifts on the Times Diary before he then got a job at Conservative HQ. And so that was that. And I mean, full disclosure, I was never properly on staff at the Evening Standard. So week on week, I didn't know if I would have shifts the next week. And it wasn't brilliantly paid. They sort of pay you a daily rate and then top it up with commission for the stories that you get. So it was insecure in multiple ways, and also because it's sort of freelance, you're paid quite late for the work that you do. So if that makes sense, like you're paid for September in the middle of October. For example, so you're always sort of 6 weeks behind financially. So it sort of felt quite insecure, but it was really, really fun. And as it happened, I had shifts there every 5 days a week, every week until I eventually left. But I was never given a proper contract, and it felt quite insecure. But I suppose for people watching who don't know much about diaries or how they work, I don't know if you know much about how diaries work. There's a great tradition in British journalism of the diary as sort of the gossip column in a newspaper. The Evening Standard Diary is called the Londoners' Diary, has been running for over 100 years, and it used to be sort of society figures would write about, a little soupçon that they heard at a dinner party, and some minor royal said this, some actor said that,
over a sherry.
Some MP said that. This sort of amazing insight into the upper crust. It has sort of evolved over time, but that's still kind of the tradition of it. So the way it would work is you'd start really early in the morning, and so we'd be in for about 7, because the paper goes to press around 11. So you'd be in quite early, and other editors would be in even earlier. And you do the morning shift with stories from the night before. Then you'd maybe hang around a little bit after you've gone to press and make some calls or whatever. But basically then you would have the afternoon free as your time off. Then in the evening you would be sent out to various parties. And so the stuff of diary work is that you go to someone's book launch or whatever, or some other party, and you're there with your dictaphone, and you just chat to people and get good lines from them and try to
I understand.
And you often go to maybe like 3 or 4 parties a night in some of the most amazing places around London. You see, like, with often quite famous people, and you just live off the champagne and canapes, maybe get home about midnight, 1 a.m. and then you're back in
for 7
a.m. And lots of journalists have started out on diaries. So Nick Watt, the political editor of Newsnight, Katie Bowles, the deputy political editor of The Spectator, James O'Brien, Elizabeth Day, people like that. I think there are probably more famous examples that I can't think of. But basically, like, the diaries, Marie LeConte as well, that political journalist. So it's a kind of great training ground for just schmoozing and making contact and thinking on your feet, like, how can I ask someone something to get a good newsline out of them? So basically, I did shifts on the Evening Standard Diary for a year, and just applied for the job at the New Statesman and got it.
Wow.
So when it came to that point, a year in, the way I had planned, where I'd see after a year of trying to get experience where I stood, I had the job at the New Statesman, which I think was just phenomenally lucky. But that was just how it worked out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably worth emphasizing that doesn't happen for a lot of people. With, like, for example, with Katie Buzz from The Spectator, who I think is one of the best journalists around.
Mm-hmm.
I did an event with her, and I was, so I told that story, and she was really keen to emphasize that's not really how it often works. And she worked on the Diary and did lots of other jobs before eventually becoming one of our best political journalists.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's just a credit to the New Statesman and to Stephen Bush in particular for having a proper open hiring process,
mm-hmm.
which I have to say is really, really rare in journalism still, that there's just a job, and that was advertised as a graduate job.
Yeah.
So you could have applied if you were just a political nerd straight out of university, or with 1 year's experience. So really, really rare starter job.
Mm-hmm.
With a proper open hiring process. I think that there were some people that they invited to apply, but a proper fair hiring process with loads and loads of rounds of interviews and tests.
Wow.
And then I magically got it. But it's worth saying that a lot of places don't hire that way.
Mm-hmm.
That some jobs get advertised, but a lot of the time people have an idea that they maybe want an economics editor or whatever, and they just think about who might be good for it.
Yeah.
and then they just they maybe run some interviews with the people that they are interested in, but there's no opportunity for people outside to apply, which is why, even though it's really unfair, I think that for people starting out in journalism, it's probably important I think it's important to tell the George Osborne story.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, there are so many people who will have received emails from me who never replied.
Yeah.
But you only need one person to reply. And I think my concern would be that only a certain type of person has the gumption to send a cheeky email asking for a job, because in a way it's a quite entitled thing to do. And so I sort of worry that the wrong people do that. And unfortunately, I think it's things like that you absolutely have to do if you want to get a job, because a lot of them aren't advertised, and eventually it's just a numbers game. Someone gets back to you, and that single break can really change the whole course of your career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, I'm a recent graduate. I'm in that world right now. It's not the most fun I've ever had in my life, but
really tough, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a grind. It's a lot of not getting replies, a lot of getting an interview and then never hearing back, a lot of slow grinding process. But anyway.
So I had an interview with the House and Home desk of a well-known national newspaper, and I still don't know if I got the internship. Still waiting to hear back.
Get an email in 2030. Hey, by the way, I mean
I know from the way the New Statesman is that is not a deliberately callous thing. It's just sort of dysfunctionality.
Chaos.
That the people who interviewed you think it's HR emailing, and HR think it's you, and then it never happens. But I know how crushing it is at the time. And I think I flew over from Belfast for that interview. I spent it, so I don't think that they realized that. But people put so much effort and time into applications and have a lot riding on them, and then the newspaper or whatever just doesn't see it that way.
Yeah, I had the exact same with an application for an internship and an interview I did with a famous American news organization, where did an interview, did a test, and then never heard back. Followed up 3 times, and they said, "Oh, sorry, you haven't got it. Do you want feedback?" And I said, "I'd love feedback." And then they never replied again. And I followed up again, and they didn't reply. So it is a slow grinding process, but it's interesting to sort of to hear about. And I think a lot of the time it is about playing the numbers game until you do eventually get lucky. I think that the one thing that's carrying me is that I have my own little thing that I do. This guy, at least I get to talk and learn a lot more about it, which I think helps. And one thing I'm interested in is talking about podcasts. How did you start off just as a political correspondent, just in journalism, the New Statesman, or was it always a a joint thing doing the podcast? Was this something that you slowly worked your way into? And what is the relationship between the two? Do they kind of feed into each other, or is it sort of a, oh, I've got to do this now, I've got to do this?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I've been asked that before. I think it was more just coincidence, really, that so the New Statesman podcast for a very long time was Helen Lewis and Stephen Bush, and that was a really well-liked duo who really bounced off each other. Helen was deputy editor of the New Statesman and a really big name. I think, arguably a bigger name than Stephen when they were doing the podcast. And then when she left, it was Anush and Stephen, and it was quite a new pairing. And they've been friends for a really, really long time and know each other very well. But they were still quite new and they were working it out when I joined. And that was around the time of, that was sort of early 2019. And whenever someone was away or something came up, someone else would have to do the podcast with Stephen or with Anush. And especially then with the 2019 general election campaign, the things were often so busy that that quite often either Patrick or I would end up doing it with one of them. And then Stephen was away reporting for, he's somewhere in the Red Wall in the 2019 general election campaign. He couldn't make it back in time. So Patrick and I did the podcast with Anush, and Stephen arrived back in the middle of it. And we just thought, we'd never done it as a quartet before, but we just kept doing it. And we had so much fun. I think there was something about the chemistry of the four of us that really, really worked. And so after that, we just decided to do it as a quartet, really. Because I think that Stephen and Anush felt that there was a better balance and a better energy and so on with the four of us. Yeah. And so that was just how it happened. And then Patrick moved on to the Times, and we kept it as a trio, which meant that kind of seamlessly it went from this not being a part of my job to being the host of the podcast. And for a while, my picture wasn't on the artwork because it had just sort of happened, but Anush and Stephen were the original hosts. Yeah. And then they updated the artwork and so on. But it really did just happen. And in terms of, I think the second bit of your question was sort of how do the two relate to each other? I think that we struggle with it. I think it's a great pleasure to do it, but it takes up a bit of time, and I think that we have a sense, maybe wrongly, that the real job is the writing of pieces. I get that. And so we decided at the start of lockdown that we should do the podcast twice a week because we just thought it would sort of keep listeners company and it would be nice. And so much of the job was stripped back in other ways, like you weren't having coffees with MPs or taking people for lunch or whatever. We felt like we had capacity to do it. And then we've kept on doing that now that things have opened up a bit, which is more difficult, definitely, because the Wi-Fi is terrible in Westminster for a start. Really? Awful. And we share an office with other publications, CNI, and the Palace of Westminster, it's an amazing place to work, but it's so old and crumbling that the window quite literally doesn't close. And where we are, we overlook Parliament Square, and it is always so noisy with protests. It sounds like we are actually recording in the street. So we always have to find a corner of Westminster that's quieter to do it.
Provide some dramatic ambiance, someone makes a controversial point, you hear boos from outside. It really creates an atmosphere.
Well, there's always the Stop Brexit guy. I don't know if you're aware of him, Steve Bray, this man who has been protesting against Brexit outside Parliament for years now. Wow. He's still there every Wednesday when there's Prime Minister's questions with a whole group of people. He has a huge loudspeaker with music that plays in the same order every single week. You have this horrible Groundhog Day feeling And he says the same thing every week. Boris Johnson, a liar, cheat, and a charlatan. And it's so strange. Because I could almost do the speech. I've heard it so many times. And so with things like that, it's really no exaggeration to just say how noisy the office is and how bad the Wi-Fi is. Basically can't record the podcast in Parliament. So we need to go to the New Statesman offices just off Fleet Street. Or we do it remotely, but we have to find some other corner. So I think kind of squeezing it in is harder because we've kept it twice a week and we're still working out what time or day would work best for it. But we I think maybe people don't realize how off the cuff the podcast is, that we really just before we start recording say, well, what should we talk about? Like, what were the questions and what should the top be? So there are some things where we would probably do it differently if we knew we were going to be talking about it with a few days in advance.
Sure.
Because sometimes it's the sort of thing that you need to have had conversations with MPs for. And sometimes you think, well, I actually haven't spoken to very many people about this issue. I don't know what Conservative MPs think about this. But it's all quite off the cuff, but people seem to like it that way. And it's sort of the only way that we can do 2 podcasts a week alongside all of the other political journalism. But it's nice because even though we think of the main job as the writing, I think that people mention the podcast to me more. And like in your case, that was how you discovered my work. And I think that's the case with a lot of people. And it's nice that people maybe then have a bit more of a sense of knowing us and our personalities and what we're up to. So I think it's great doing the podcast alongside the other work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this podcast is also very off the cuff. I don't have 4 pages of notes on my other monitor. Obviously, this is all on top of my head. I'm very good at that. Yeah, I was going to say, so obviously the majority of your work and the majority of journalism is done in the traditional format of written work, of newspapers and on websites. But interested in sort of, you've had this sort of taste of, I guess, new media, of podcasting and other areas. I think, do you see yourself in the future sort of branching out more into these areas, into more podcasts, more sort of video content or audio content of some form, or do you think you'll always sort of stay with that bedrock of writing work?
Oh, good question. I've said that lots of times. I'm enjoying these questions. I think actually, I think it depends on the journalist, but I'm really aware that I have some colleagues who are really beautiful writers. Someone like Patrick Maguire at the Times just writes beautifully, and I'm sure, although I've never discussed it with him, I'm sure he sees himself as a writer first and foremost, as well as a reporter. Sure. And I don't think that that's me. Not that I think I write particularly badly, but I'm really not wedded to the written word at all. And I've been researching quite a long piece for the magazine at the moment. I did a lot of reporting for it in Northern Ireland. I've been doing like lots and lots of conversations for it. And my feeling has just been that I kind of care about the content and I don't care so much about the eventual delivery. Like, if I'll write it up as a long piece and hopefully people will enjoy it, but equally I would very happily produce it as a documentary or as a long form podcast, or and actually there's a case, I had a really moving interview with someone for this piece, and her voice is very, very powerful. I think I'm going to ask our producer to put it on the podcast to discuss the piece when it's out in September. But you lose the voice when it's just written down. And I think especially like this is quite a heavy piece. A lot of people broke down while I was speaking to them, and you can write that they broke down, but I think hearing the person pause and the thing that catches in their throat is quite powerful. So I actually would quite like to maybe work more in podcasts or audio or video or do more broadcasting. because I'm just much more interested in telling the stories and the content. And I have a feeling when you're writing for print, it feels like such an extraordinary privilege sometimes when you're sitting in an MP's office, or you're at some dinner or some party, or in this case, you go to visit this woman to have this very heavy conversation. You're sitting in her living room with her, and I feel like when you're just writing it, you're sort of saving it all for yourself. That you can only really write a small fraction of that experience, and then, but the immense privilege of being the person who gets to be in that room is really only enjoyed by you. And I had a real sense when I was, in a lot of situations, I think, well, actually, it'd be great if readers could be here too in a more intimate way, either hearing the voice or seeing the video footage, or just a bit being given a bit more of the color and the experience of it. So obviously political journalism doesn't work so much like that even, you see Laura Kuenssberg on the news, you're not getting footage of her sitting in MPs' offices all day having these private conversations. But I just think as much as possible, you want to be including readers or viewers in the experience. And so it's something I think quite a lot about. I think maybe video and audio is a less selfish way of doing journalism in a way, because you're able to share more. And so it is something that I think about. But it's interesting. I don't know what will happen with podcasts, because there's such a podcast boom at the moment, and I don't know how that will change. Because I suppose the initial idea with podcasts is stuff like this, as you say, like not terribly scripted, just a genuine conversation. I think the way that Stephen and Anush and I chat on the podcast is not the way we speak if we're doing broadcast for radio or something. We split it, it's more rambly, and it's much less formal. But I think maybe podcasts are moving towards being more formal and more heavily produced. So I'm not really sure where journalism will fit into that in 5 years' time, whether actually people's long reports will be carefully crafted long form podcasts, or whether the interest will wane.
It's an interesting one. I think, I would say rather similarly at university, I did a lot of writing. I wrote for student publications and things like that. And then I started this as a student radio show, and I enjoyed that way more. And then I started making YouTube videos about politics, and I've enjoyed that way more. And I'd say primarily, I'm a video maker. It's what I enjoy the most, and it's how I personally like to portray information. And I think that reading a lot of your work, I'd say one of your best skills is sort of talking about like Brexit in Ireland is incredibly complicated issues, sort of taking something incredibly complicated and taking out what's important and what it sort of leads to afterwards. I think is something I've read a lot in your work. So a lot of your pieces are rather short in nature. They're quite, here's an issue, here's what's happening, here's lots of complicated stuff, but here's what you would need to know, or here's what's going to actually be actionable from this. And I think that that's a skill that suits really well to more like audio and visual forms of communication, because taking what's important and being able to dilute that quickly is what I think really is interesting. I don't know. It's my crackpot theory. I think that journalism is going to become a video thing pretty soon. I think that's going to be the next wave, is sort of like short videos, quite similar to like Lewis Goodall's work on BBC Newsnight, where he has the whole fancy board and then moving things, or like what Jeremy Vine does on elections. I think that is going to be a big part of the future of journalism issues on platforms like YouTube. Not to toot my own horn, but Sorry.
It's interesting though, because I think one area where written journalism or print journalism has its own strength is with interviews. And it's something that I'm really aware of, because the New Statesman is expanding at the moment, and we have a new podcast producer who's brilliant, and we're also hiring, we've got a new video content producer, and we'll be doing a lot more of that. But I think it's something that we've all had discussions about, that print interviews are very, very different to podcast interviews or any sort of recorded broadcast interview. And I think that maybe people don't realize how different they are when they just see the end product. You read the print interview, you watch the broadcast interview, and you imagine that the way the questions were put in the print interview must resemble the way the thing looks when it's on TV. but it's completely different. I think that the interviewer is often like sort of much more familiar, asks much more leading questions, knowing that their side of the interaction is not going to be
okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
I think that, I mean, it depends. People do it in different ways, but I think that the joy of a print interview is how intimate it is. People forget that they're being recorded. If you establish a quite comfortable atmosphere, people reveal more and more and really say what they mean, which is actually what you want. I think it's not so much about catching people out. I don't really care about that. If people accidentally say something that they don't really mean, I think that's a rubbish news line in a way. I think the value is in getting people to actually say what they mean, what they've really been thinking, even if they didn't really plan on saying it to a journalist. And those revealing moments, I think maybe are better set up in print interviews. And I think there's a real art to print interviews and a great tradition of it in British journalism. So Charlotte Edwards, who used to be the editor of the Evening Standard Diary, is one of the best print interviewers of politicians, but also celebrities. In my view, she's won lots and lots of awards for her interviews. Someone like Lynn Barber, I don't know if you're aware of her, but she has this sort of towering reputation as a quite tough interviewer. She's, done really like sort of hatchet jobs on previously really, not highly regarded people.
Sure.
She tears them to shreds in these legendary print interviews. I think that it's so different when it's recorded, and especially if people are on camera. I think people maybe feel a bit more exposed, and so I think that there's definitely a place for the print interview.
Sure.
And but in general, I agree that I think that video content is going to be a bigger and bigger part of what we do. The question is just how it fits in with the bigger context of how to make money from journalism, because I think video is very expensive, and the industry in general is already thinking about how you make this sustainable and how you have sustainable revenues from journalism in an internet age. And I'm not sure any publication has completely cracked that yet, and the place that video should play within it.
It's definitely a tricky one because for say like YouTube has a pretty simple to understand like monetization system, but there's a real difference in quality expected from me in this bedroom in comparison to a prestigious institution like the New Statesman. There's a real jump that needs to be made, and that jump is always going to be really expensive and difficult to make. And also it's there's differences in sort of what is appealing, but I think that as so I'm 21, and I think as sort of I get older, I don't think that I'm going to be abandoning sort of the platforms that I use as much. I think that video content is going to become more natural and mainstream, whereas right now it's seen as a bit more, I guess, like younger and cooler. What was I going to say? I was going to ask about. So it's so interesting thinking about journalism in terms of how different the content becomes depending on the different medium. Because obviously, like you said, like podcasts and a written interview are very different. Then there's also, is it live or is it beforehand? Can it be edited? Is there an audience? And I think that's something really interesting. How much in the work that you do, whether it be written interviews or the podcast or everything else, how conscious are you of the different medium and how that influences the type of approach you take, or is it something that seems just a bit more like natural and is fitted into quite easily, or is it really like a conscious decision? Okay, I'm doing something on live TV, I have to change very, very seriously in different ways.
I suppose it is something I think about, but I suppose the bread and butter is written stuff. So that's sort of what I'm most used to. And I think especially the way we approach the podcast is that that's the thing we fit in around everything else, and we quite deliberately don't plan it too much, and we leave it as quite off the cuff and just to sort of chat about what's going on in Westminster. So I think quite consciously with that podcast and also with this one, I just try to chat. And and leave it like a podcast rather than like another piece of broadcasting. Whereas for live TV, I think you're aware, and the producers and presenters just make you very aware of the need to be very clear, very short and snappy. And I can feel myself being very different when I do those things. And often in your ear they say, we're coming to the end of the program, or we have a video that we need to play before the end of the program. So when Joe comes to you, just 20-second answer, 20 seconds. Wow. And you think, how am I going to say anything meaningful in 20 seconds? We kind of have to play along with it. So I do think about that. And I think I also am much more careful to explain things clearly and not assume much prior knowledge on broadcast and live TV. Whereas I think on the podcast, maybe wrongly, we just assume that listeners, given what sort of our understanding of our listenership is, that we sort of assume that we don't need to signpost so much.
Yeah, I think that also is depending on sort of like the format as well, where it is conversational. It feels like you're having a conversation if you're listening to it. If you don't understand what something means, you're not going to be like, oh, that's so annoying, they done a terrible job. It's a conversation. You go, oh, okay, I'm just going to quietly Google that, and then boom, you're back into it. Whereas I think if you saw someone on TV and they said something that I didn't personally understand, I would have more of an attitude of, that's their fault for not having me understand, rather than on a podcast where it's, oh, okay, I'm just going to fill that in quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe for print, the main difference, I suppose, is whether I think if you're writing a longer piece, you have a sense of how you're going to write up different vignettes and where the different voices will come in. And it's a lot of on the record stuff, I suppose. Whereas in the day-to-day of Westminster, so much is just off the record. And often you have a conversation without knowing what piece you're going to write off the back of it, for example.
Okay,
and so then you're hearing people's opinions, and you've no idea how you sort of absorb whatever this person has said, and then you'll maybe refer to it on the podcast at some stage, or it'll crop up in a piece. But I suppose in the everyday job, you're kind of just aware of trying to absorb as much of the mood and the views as possible, but you don't know where it's going to appear in your work.
How difficult is it developing that sort of acumen for having a conversation with someone and thinking that sentence, keep that, and then being able to reproduce it in a way that seems pretty relevant? Because it almost feels like, you're doing the schmoozing and schmizing, you're at the Ferrero Rocher party, and you have like 100 conversations, you take little bits from each one, and then boom, recall, this is relevant right there. Is this something that sort of came naturally to you, or is it a skill that you really had to develop perhaps in your diary work and then throughout your career?
Yeah, I think it's a skill that I'm always working on, and I think that it's something that I would imagine, I don't think I've ever discussed this with other political journalists, but I think it's probably something that everyone slightly struggles with in terms of, like, political journalism is very different to other kinds of journalism, in that one of the big challenges is how chummy it is, and this tension where you're almost biting the hand that feeds you. You're trying to cultivate these really close relationships with the people that you're trying to scrutinize. And so on the one hand, there's an incentive to be very friendly and chummy and take people for drinks and coffees and dinners, to almost strike up a genuine friendship with people beyond a work relationship, and to cultivate a real sort of trust and warmth, and to like each other and like visibly feel that you like each other. And then on the other hand, to be prepared to give that person both barrels in print, and so I think that it's something I'm always aware of, especially because the nature of it is so much sort of off-record conversations, and a lot of the time people tell you a lot of stuff that they just expect you to never reproduce. And it's always a tricky one because, you know, in terms of not revealing your sources, sometimes people tell you good stuff that you can't use because you would burn the contact, because it would be too obvious who it was that told you something.
Okay.
Or you think, maybe I won't use that because maybe that source will tell me something even better. You know, that person on the shadow cabinet, I'm not going to put that thing that they've told me in print anywhere, because I want to save them you know, for them to say something better to me in 6 months' time. So I think that it is quite tricky how much you just use everything that you've been given, but potentially alienate your sources, and then how much you hold back. I think it's something that definitely I think about a lot, and people take different approaches to, especially if you're doing more analysis and commentary and off-record conversations. Whereas if you're interviewing someone for a piece and it isn't on the record chat, then where you stand with things is much easier. Or even then, you know, you do on the record and then you do a 5-minute background chat afterwards. So you use the information but don't reveal where you got it from.
Okay, that's interesting.
Like something like that is much easier to navigate when you're working on a specific piece and you have quite clearly defined parameters of on the record, background, off record, or whatever. It's more the day-to-day stuff of political journalism, I think, is way harder, and something that I'm still slightly working out.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. It's like that sort of looking into that world and these sort of the complicated relationships that form. So it reminds me of like so many, like, you know, almost like to make it a film, or I guess a literature reference, it'd be like Sherlock and Irene Adler type thing, where it's like you're kind of, you know, you're building something up, but also you don't really trust each other, don't want to give too much away, and that sort of builds up and up. You know, like you're going on a date with someone, but you know they're going to write a report about you. At the end of the night, you're like, okay, well,
that is exactly what it's like. It honestly is like dating half of Westminster, taking people for drinks, taking people for coffees,
but you get to date Boris Johnson, which, I mean, you know, only several of us have been so lucky.
Yeah. I've never taken Boris Johnson for lunch, sadly.
Who knows? Oh, God, but that is fascinating. And then all sort of building up to something. It's a complicated one. Every time I get to chat to a journalist, it's something I always want to ask about, because it's like it's such a microcosm little chess game that goes on that we never really get to see as someone from the outside, and it's fascinating. Is it quite stressful? I imagine it must be quite difficult to sort of making these decisions and thinking this would be great, but also I don't want to lose this or whatever. It must surely be quite stressful to sort of navigate that world.
I think there are definitely parts of that world that are stressful, but I think that side is actually okay. Or it's hit and miss. I think that definitely there have been times where I have maybe used too much of what people have told me, and then they have trusted me less in the future. And then there have been other times where someone has said something to me and said that they don't want me to use it, and I haven't. And I've always wondered if I just should have, because ultimately, why are they telling a journalist if they don't want it to be in print somewhere in some form? So I think I don't find it too stressful, actually, but it's something that I'm just it's one of these areas that I'm always intrigued as to how other journalists grapple with it. I think different people make very different calls on it.
Are you ever concerned about that relationship, though, where it is sort of, you know, I think where it is that you have to build these relationships, but then also your job is to take these people to account and report on them. I think it's something that people see on a lot from the outsiders, sort of whether there is that real string of accountability. Is that something that you ever keep, you know, conscious in your mind, where you have to balance between, I need to have a relationship with this person to build up to, you know, to be able to report on what's going on, but also it's my job to, you know, inform the public and report on these issues? Is that something that is quite conscious? Is it difficult to navigate?
Yeah, and I think actually it's been on my mind quite a lot recently, having been back in Northern Ireland reporting on a big piece. And I think that thinking about this issue in relation to Northern Irish politics has really sharpened my view of it, and and my view of what's important in journalism. And so I think that Westminster can be very chummy, and there's just a sort of sense of the cultivating these really, really close relationships with people, and sort of wanting to get news and wanting to get stories, but not thinking about the more profound purpose of it. And then especially in Northern Ireland, where I think that the pool of journalists is really, really small, and they punch above their weight massively and do a great job. That's like the work of making sure that Northern Irish democracy functions properly. And I think that observing that in Northern Ireland and seeing how necessary it is, I then came back to Westminster this week, having been at home for a few weeks, and I just feel recommitted to doing the scrutiny work that that like these people are absolutely not your friends. Even if there are lots of people that you respect and trust and so on, that actually I think that probably a lot of journalists in Westminster could do with, well, maybe this isn't fair, but completely disregarding the relationships that you need to have with your sources, and focusing so much more just on holding people to account and being skeptical. And interestingly, Dominic Cummings, don't know what you think of him. Dominic Cummings in his new life as a Twitter person, just tweeting all day every day, rather than
slowly revealing the only word I have in my head is nefarious actions of his time.
Well, he so controversially, I always love a Dominic Cummings intervention. I think I will never not be really interested in what he has to say. And I think I find it very interesting, his criticisms of Westminster journalism, and particularly of the commentariat. And his argument has been that since he first worked as an advisor about a decade ago, that the lobbies of the group of journalists in Westminster with Westminster Press Passes, the lobby has become less skeptical. And I don't know if that's true. I can't compare it myself. But he was talking about how there's a lot of, he described it as an information war, where special advisors and ministers and so on brief journalists and tell them about what's going on inside government, and journalists write it up. They don't really know if it's true or not. How do you fact check that kind of thing? How do you fact check that kind of thing? And I suppose sometimes I think that there is value to telling people what's going on, especially, I end up doing that a lot in relation to the Labour Party, telling people, this conversation happened or whatever, but you can't fact check it. I mean, you can double source it, ask a few people independent of each other if that happened. But in a way, it's just spin. And Dominic Cummings was talking about, how journalists sometimes end up being pawns in an information war. And so I do think a lot about the function of that kind of journalism, and how much I want to be doing that, and how much I want to be doing other stuff, especially because I suppose opinion journalism is really cheap, and there's loads of it now because it is quite profitable for publications, and robust reporting is really cost intensive and resource intensive, and so it's more and more scarce. But that's where the real value is, I think.
No, but that is super interesting. It's a complicated world, I think, that relationship and how it's going to be moving on into the future, especially considering that the role of sort of the internet in journalism is still pretty new, and then how that can be manipulated and taken forward is going to be changing a lot as well. I think I'd say about every 10 years is going to be some sort of radical change by some individual. But anyway, I'm sure we could go on for another 2 hours, but this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on, Ailbhe. question: can we have any clues of what's to come? Ooh, from your work and from the podcast.
Oh, well, yeah, look out for, I feel like I've given you lots of trails for this big piece in September. Look out for that. I've been putting, blood, sweat and tears into it.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone listening has to read it.
That is a deal. Everyone listening does indeed have to read it. I will make sure to share it when it comes around. But anyway, Ailbhe, thank you so much for coming on. It's been lovely having to chat to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like I've done a lot of navel gazing, but hopefully for listeners and viewers who want to get into journalism, it provides a bit of insight.
Yeah, no, that is perfect. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for watching. Once again, at Pronounced Ailbhe on Twitter, check her out. Subscribe to Dutiful Future. We're on every podcast platform you can imagine. We're also on Twitter of Dutiful Future. My SEO is amazing. You search it, you find it. It's all very easy. Thanks, everyone. See you around.